So yeah, great to be back again this year. Very grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak, given the circumstances, particularly to the OpenSSF for a bit of travel assistance to be able to be here in person. I'm expanding on some of the areas that I touched on in my presentation from BonCon last year around observations of and thoughts on the challenges in vulnerability metadata quality. For context, if you're not familiar with last year's talk or who I am, I'm Andrew. I'm from Australia. I get up at early o'clock to be in some working group meetings, sometimes based in Brisbane. I've spent the last couple of years working on Google's open source security team, working on OSV in particular, and it's probably been the highlight of my 2-decade career at Google. So I've really had a lot of fun. And an area of passion for me is around data quality and consistency and completeness. So in a nutshell, the work that I did that led me to sort of get to where I am right now is I wrote some code to take CVEs from the NVD using the CPE dictionary, try to determine the Git repository for the source code and the software the CVE referred to, and then use that to generate an OSV record, and then do all of the things that you'd want to do with an OSV record. This is the percentage of CVEs that have been deemed to be in scope for conversion that have actually successfully converted. It's been pleasingly consistent. Oh, there it is. It's been pleasingly consistent year to year. You can see that the NVD analysis slowdown did have a bit of a negative impact on it. The primary intended benefit of this work is to gain coverage of C and C++ vulnerabilities, as there's no comprehensive centralized source of them. Due to the somewhat unique nature of how open source C and C++ software is used, the most effective way to scan for this in source code is by commit hash. And so that was the whole sort of purpose of this exercise was to have commit level vulnerability metadata on those CVEs. You can read more about that work and the application of it on the OSV.dev blog. When I came into this work, this task, this project, I was a complete newcomer to the state of the art in CVE. Like I was around back when in 99 when CVEs came out. I didn't work in any sort of vulnerability capacity back then, so I had to sort of catch up with where things were at. I spent some time learning about how the entire sausage was made, probably in the most suboptimal way, to be honest. But I think a lot of people up until last year didn't appreciate that the NVD was not the CVE list. So I myself included, because my brief was convert from the NVD. I'm like, cool, okay. And then yeah, I learned about the entire thing in more detail than I think most people necessarily know, and I'm happy to share that later on if you don't know. Last year's call to action from my talk was to address a couple of the systemic challenges that I was seeing in the data quality as part of that conversion effort. And in the ensuing time since last year's VolnCon, and I had some excellent hallway conversations off the back of my talk, and a lot of interesting follow-up conversations, and I sort of more actively engaged with the QWG afterwards. I've learned more, and I've dug into the problem more, and we'll take a bit more of a specific look at that rather than last year's talk where I sort of talked about the nature of the work. So I picked hopefully an interesting title to bring you all here. Thanks for coming to my TED talk. Fitness for purpose. I like to think about why. Why are we doing this? Why do we have vulnerability metadata in the first place? It's so that the defenders and end users of vulnerable software can know that they're impacted and then know how to make the problem go away. Pretty straightforward, right? So today, I'll take you on a bit of an exploration of this and my takes on some of the barriers to achieving that why, and give you my thoughts on some areas for improvement. But before I do that, I'll do a little bit of a side-by-side, to the best of my ability, comparison between my understanding of the CVE list and the current state of things over the fence in the land of OSV. So for anybody unfamiliar with OSV, it's been around for 4 years, and it was created to facilitate precise identification of vulnerabilities in open source software. OSS Fuzz was the catalyst because it was finding vulnerabilities in open source projects that it was fuzzing, and they wanted some way to be able to express those findings. And at the time, CVE 4.0 was the state of the art. It wasn't great at expressing vulnerabilities in open source. And in addition to that, the idea of automatically submitting CVEs sort of gave everybody the heebie-jeebies. So OSV popped up as a sort of parallel opportunity to be able to express those vulnerabilities and in an automated fashion. When the OpenSSF formed, Google donated the OSV schema to the OpenSSF as a bit of IP. Google operates and sponsors the infrastructure for the open source projects that implement OSV.dev, the central aggregator database for home databases publishing records in the OSV format, and first-party reference tooling using the database's API. And we've just recently also brought out a software composition analysis library because we're now branching into being able to facilitate not just source code level vulnerability scanning, but container image scanning as well. And all of that freely available, open source. You can clone it, look at it, poke at it, understand how it's working. You can contribute to it. And it's all completely free to use. In terms of coverage, we've got every language ecosystems packages and a growing number of Linux distributions. Like we had a pretty gangbuster year last year in terms of grabbing Linux distributions. So we've sort of moved up the stack a little bit. And then, yeah, like I said, the ultimate area of interest is to make container image scanning ubiquitously easy. So getting into the comparisons now, mission statements. I'll have a good mission statement. I like mission statements that can help with evaluating if an activity is on mission or not. And I think it's that's a valid question to be asking from time to time to make sure that you haven't gone off into the weeds. I also like to be able to ask the question of when can you declare mission accomplished? The CVE program's mission statement has remained unchanged for 25 years. And I think that the lack of an explicit why in there is a little bit problematic, because I think the why 25 years ago and the why today have changed a bit. Now, if you look at the OSV program's mission statement, it's a little bit more unequivocal as to why it's doing what it's doing. Its ultimate goal is risk reduction. There's also a specific target audience. I would argue it's a little bit narrower than it needs to be, but it is what it is. So the CVE program has a bit of an implicit all. OSV.dev's got a narrower scope. It's only open source related stuff. So a little bit of an apples and oranges, but that is what it is. Scale-wise, like I said, 25 years for the CVE program, very different world today. Back in 1999, the CVE list had about 1,500 vulnerabilities. That's actually declined by 20% in 2000 to only 1,200 or so. If you jump forward to 2024, I did all this off last year's data for a full year. The CVE list contained, depending on how you count them, 37,381 vulnerabilities from 307 distinct CNAs. Now, if you compare that with what OSV.dev's got, we've got 82,000, almost 83,000 vulnerabilities that have a publication date from 2024 from 21 different home databases. Of these in 2024, almost 10,000 of those vulnerability records had a direct alias to a CVE ID, and then another 58,000 of them had some sort of a cross-reference. There's a few different ways you can express a relationship to other record IDs. So unsurprisingly, given that difference in scope, there's also the age difference. Remember, this is 4 years old. We've got some significant variation in the sources of records. So all up, you've got 447 CNAs as of the end of last year, and 125 of them having some sort of a declaration of relating to open source. There's a little bit of funkiness with that, with around how you count that, because types is a, you can have more than one type on a CNA in the metadata, so it's not necessarily a hard number. And CNAs can wear multiple hats, as you know. OSV has 22 what we call home databases, and so that is the moral equivalent of a CNA for comparison purposes. They own their records, they publish their records, and then OSV.dev does a pull on them. So I'll just do a little side trip on scale for a moment, because I think scale is a challenge. Like, scale is why we are where we're at today. So we know that along with death and taxes, there's another certainty that there'll be more vulnerabilities next year than there were this year. Like, we've got 25 years worth of evidence to basically show that that's an up and to the right movement. Sadly, that's the case, right? Like, I think we all look forward to a day when that truism isn't the case anymore, but that's sort of the world we live in. Now, that level of vulnerabilities is hard for everybody that's in this space, right? Like, it's hard for vendors to keep on top of, it's hard for defenders to keep on top of, and it's hard for analysts to have to do things like I feel like that scale, the NVD is a casualty of that scale, right? Because there's a human analysis component to their work. And we only, there's the data on that, right? We only saw about half of the ones from last year able to be analyzed by the NVD as a result. And if you look at CIS's vol enrichment progress last year, they had varying degrees of coverage as well, depending on how you count what they did. I think it's ultimately like you can boost that with things like potentially Ryan's really cool project. That's a really cool thing to lead in with. Good job with the program there, Crow. To sort of optimize that a little bit, but there is an inherent amount of human effort that goes into analysis, right? So you can optimize that only so much with scale before it just has a fan out problem. And I don't work on the analysis side, but I can only imagine what that must feel like. I'm sure if you hit up our friends in the NVD and in vol enrichment, they've probably got some great war stories they could share with you over an adult beverage at some point. So what do? You automate, right? So you send in the machines. The only way to reason about vulnerabilities at that sort of scale is programmatically, or maybe with AI, minus the hallucinations. This helps the humans with the detection, the higher order things like classification, validation and prioritization, and ultimately remediation or mitigation of them. So once the vulnerability record's out in the wild, defenders need to be able to act on it as quickly as they are able to. And so the less systematic barriers to that response ability, the better for everybody. So fortunately, the CVE program realized this back in 2018, when we were only dealing with 17,000 odd CVEs, and they launched the first iteration of a richer JSON format. And as an attempt to address some of the deficiencies with that format for describing open source vulnerabilities, as I said, the OSV schema and OSV.dev, which used it, launched in 2021 when we were dealing with 23,000 CVEs. And then in 2022, we had the really big uplift we're at 26,000 CVEs, and the first iteration of the CVE JSON 5 schema came out. And that was a real game changer in terms of theoretical capability. And the OSV schema had some influences on that, because we came out with that first. When the CVE 5 schema was being developed, we sort of rocked up and said, hey, take a look at this. And so there's some influences there, and there's some theoretical interoperability as well as a result. So, and then this is where I start to get a little bit sad. So this is a quote I took out of the very shiny 25th anniversary report. So it evolved with the needs of the time, and we're at this current pinnacle of theoretical machine readability. And that is the rub, my friends. Just because it can doesn't mean it is. Jerry Gamblin really drove this point home earlier in the week. Yesterday, actually. 25 years later. Sorry, must not rant too hard. 25 years later, when we were at 20 times the volume of CVEs than we were when we first came along with this thing, nothing has changed in terms of what is required to be in a CVE record, right? So when we first started this, remember, 20 times less volume than what we're dealing with now, you needed an ID, a description, and maybe one or more references. That's the same deal 25 years later. 25 years, just saying. The only thing worse than tantalizingly machine-readable data is when it's inconsistently used. Here's one of my favorite things I like to wave around. I've got a hobby horse. Welcome to my TED Talk. Last year, 15%, count them, 15% of CVEs had no attempt, none, zero attempt at usable data in the affected field. I'm sad. It's really, really, really difficult to accurately quantify the usability of the data that is present because, hey, if I could quantify it in a machine readable way, it wouldn't be a problem. I looked at some and, just eyeballing them as I was making this presentation, I could see versions claiming to be SEMVer, and I think Martin pointed that out this morning in his presentation. I love how many data quality theme talks there are this year, by the way. They're claiming to be SEMVer. They're clearly not, right? Like they either didn't have 3 bits or I've seen ones with asterisks in there and stuff like that. It's like, come on, guys. So cool that we have version types. Not cool that we're using them as labeled, right? So this inconsistent use of the record format undermines the great potential of machine readability. This hampers the ability to do meaningful vulnerability management in any way, shape, or form at scale, right? Got to do better. There is no remediation at scale without first detection at scale. And I feel like for the longest time, identifying was declared done by the existence of the CVE ID itself and a human readable description, right? That might have flown 25 years ago. It does not fly today when we are drowning in vulnerabilities. You've got to have something that is automation friendly and not just the capability, the theoretical capability. It has to be automation friendly. It has to be accurate. I like the term that I've heard a few times this week, completeness of a record, right? So, there's this concept now of, is a CVE record complete if it's not automation friendly and accurate? So I understand the history, totally understand the history. The CVE program had to federate to deal with scaling challenges. If you've got no consistency, it's in the realms of pointless. For it to be truly fit for purpose, for direct end use detection or even downstream analysis or anything, the CNA that issues a CVE needs to be an implementation detail, particularly as we keep growing year over year with CNAs. Federation is very hard to do well, and it's even harder to try and fix things up retrospectively, particularly while you're still federating like a demon, right? So you haven't even shut the barn door and there's more horses coming out of it, right? So that's unfortunately the position the CVE program finds itself in. So this is the current ever-growing number of unique snowflakes in the form of CNAs. So it's not feasible for the downstream consumers of the CVE list to have to maintain per CNA heuristics for how to machine process a specific CVE, right? Like that's just a losing battle, right? This log scale chart shows that there's a steep drop off in terms of the volume of CVEs per CNA. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. In one of the sessions yesterday, a remark was made that made me have a little bit of a giggle to myself. It's just a matter of getting the CNAs to do it right. Like, that's a lot of cats to herd, isn't it, right? And an ever-growing number of cats to try and herd to do it right. So between the number of CNAs currently in existence and publishing CVEs and this year-over-year growth in CNAs, it's not a straightforward undertaking. I get that. That is a hard problem to try and put back in the barn. One approach to address this is the CISA Secure by Design pledge. It's a good start, definitely a good start, and it may do a good enough job over time. It's only relatively young. The problem with this approach is it's entirely voluntary. And today it's very, very specific and prescriptive about what it entails. And I think that by complying with the pledge as it's currently specified, it may be inadequate for achieving machine readable detection and machine readable prioritization, because it's emphasizing the implementation detail of CPE in particular rather than enabling the desired outcome. Now, obviously, remember, I'm coming from an open source sort of angle. So CPEs might be good enough for non-open source vulnerability management, hardware appliance type stuff, maybe. But you know, like for open source, CPEs are problematic. And again, Martin did a really good job of sort of taking folks through that. So if you didn't attend his talk this morning, highly recommend watching that when it comes up on YouTube. It's early days, and based on my calculations, the set of pledge takers only covers 16% of the CVE list for 2024. So it'll be interesting to see how that's trending by the end of 2025. And I was also reminded this week of the ERL, the enrichment recognition list, which is kind of the other side of what is essentially the same outcomes as the CISA pledge. It's some nice positive reinforcement of something that is a voluntary activity, but I'm skeptical that any C-level executive at any CNA organization is going to care one way or another, right? Like, it's only going to matter if vendor customers make it matter, right? So it's nice. It's a nice sort of positive reinforcement, nice feedback loop, nice sort of report, if you will, of how it's going. But I don't know that it's going to have the necessary motivating factors that we need it to kind of have. Based on our experiences with converting CVEs from the NBD and the observations of the state of the CVE list, we were able to capitalize on OSV's relative youth and the innate data quality of our existing data sources as the starting point. And we're in the more enviable position of seeking to prevent backsliding on that existing data quality rather than needing to remediate the behavior of an order of magnitude more data providers, as well as all of the new ones coming on board year over year. So yeah, it's a different problem space for us. And what we've done for OSV.dev is we've defined what we consider to be the minimum properties of a high quality OSV record, which will be required. Ultimately, we will require that to successfully import a record. And so broadly, it needs to be valid, precise, and identifiable. We've jammed every possible validation into the JSON schema for an OSV record. So if it passes validation, good. This allows for record publishers to pre-validate the structural aspects of a record prior to publication. Unfortunately, JSON schema validation can only do so much. It's totally possible to have a schema compliant but utterly nonsensical record. So we're also working on a record linter to enable deeper validation of a record, and that was inspired by CVE lint, again by Martin, who remind me, Martin, did you write that after we chatted at BonCon last year? I think you might have. Yeah, love it. And so yeah, I was like inspired by that. Went cool. We need one of them for OSV as well. And so that's sort of what the origin story for that. And that lives in the GitHub repo for the schema if you want to look at my terrible code and contribute to it. A precise record has at publication time correctly ordered and existing versions and refers to something that verifiably exists. I've repeatedly heard this argument that if the CVE program makes it too onerous for a CNA to create and submit a CVE, that they'll simply refuse to participate. That there's this delicate, fragile, entirely voluntary arrangement in place that risks collapsing in a heap if we go and require too much of CNAs to submit a CVE in the first place. I'd like to strongly challenge this argument. I do think that there is a significant misalignment of incentives, which contributes to some of the tension here. And I'd like to explore that for a moment. On the supply side, CNAs, particularly ones who are product vendors, are dealing with product vulnerabilities as part of their product or software development lifecycle. They're doing that on an individual basis. And when you're dealing with a CVE on an individual basis, it's entirely understandable to focus on the parts that are human-oriented, in particular, that description. I get it. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that. So we have these CVEs with beautiful, sometimes not, human readable descriptions of the vulnerability, the version it was introduced in, the version it was fixed in, and all the things that the defender needs to know if they're looking at that CVE in isolation. The problem is they're not. They're looking at this CVE along with all the other ones that are flooding in. They need to know which ones apply to them, which ones need to be patched first or sooner than a normal patch cycle. And they may be a link in the chain themselves. So it becomes a turtles all the way down sort of scenario. So I want to go a little bit deeper on a few of these external pressures. I'm of the opinion that the external pressures between government compliance and private customer contractual obligations and external vulnerability research is kicking up a stink if they don't get the CVEs issued for their vulnerability discoveries, and peer pressure from within the CVE program will make it untenable for a product vendor to stop participating. I also think there's a really good opportunity to more broadly encourage commercial product purchasing decisions to include the track record of a product's vulnerability management, right? Like I think we've fortunately got past the idea of CVEs being used as a mark of shame and more as evidence of a mature vulnerability lifecycle management sort of story for a product. So, I don't think that we should be regressing back to that as the metric of sales conversations. But I think if you have a story around how easy you are making your customers' vulnerability management story by having high quality CVE records, that can be a point of differentiation between competing vendors. So I would rather say, rather than don't participate, be an exemplar and then use that as a point of competition. I feel very strongly, if you haven't noticed, that the urgently necessary evolution of the CVE program's fitness for purpose should not be held hostage by CNAs that wish to threaten to vote with their feet. It would make for an interesting case study to observe the market effects of a vendor CNA electing to take that action. The other one is a more interesting take on the whole product vulnerability management approach that I've seen more in the open source space. It boils down to, rather simplistically, to saying that all software has inherent and potentially unknown security vulnerabilities. And if there's a newer version for the thing available, then you should just upgrade to it as soon as possible. So 2 examples of this philosophy with somewhat different approaches to it are Chromium and the Linux kernel, right? Like the Linux kernel has unabashedly said, we don't know whether this is actually going to affect you or not, but we're going to assume that it does have security ramifications. Here's a CVE. And then we're all like, holy crap, look at all these CVEs. Whereas Chromium has come and said, every update we make, you should assume has some security vulnerabilities. And therefore you should always upgrade. Like that, their philosophy is trying to do vulnerability management is the fool's errand, just upgrade. Now, restarting your browser and rebooting your Linux kernel running infrastructure, although I guess we've got hot updates and stuff like that these days, so maybe it's not such a big deal as it used to be. I haven't had to sysm in a Linux box in anger for a while, thank God. But yeah, those are 2 very different approaches. So that's some of that misalignment of incentives. If we look at the basic life cycle of vulnerability disclosure from discovery through to CVE publication, ideally in conjunction with a fix being released, we have a few different personas involved. I like sort of taking the persona sort of product sort of mentality. So we've got Faith, the finder, Kathy, the CNA operator, Veronica, the vulnerability subject owner, and Lucky, the vulnerability impacted user. And then, as I said, we've got a bunch of different types of CNAs. I'm going to focus on just a subset today. I'll focus on vendor, open source, researcher, and bug bounty provider. These contributed to about 80% of the CVEs in 2024. So, you know, rather than prattle on for all the other more niche ones, we'll just focus on those four. So let's start with vendor CNAs, because that's by far the lion's share of contributing CNAs to 2024's CVEs. In the case of a vendor CNA, they've got the best opportunity for high quality communication when Faith, the finder, is in-house. Faith could also be an external vulnerability researcher or reporter. Importantly, the CNA function has the greatest chance of high fidelity communication with the owner of the thing that is vulnerable because they're all in-house. You can walk down the hallway, you can jump on a Teams call or a Google Meet or whatever and have a chat. So you'd expect CVEs issued by product vendors to have the easiest time including the sort of information needed for a high quality actionable CVE record. Now, if we look at the various outcomes that the parties are incentivized for, our vulnerability finder Faith, particularly the external one, wants the CVE ID. They want it for credit, they want it for their resume, they want bragging rights, whatever. Our vendor, they just want everyone to stop bothering them. They want to meet their regulatory and contractual obligations around disclosure, for which the existence of potentially an incredibly basic 1999 style CVE may be sufficient to tick that box. It certainly is for CVE record publication, as I just said. They also want their customers not to give them grief about known vulnerabilities in their products. A false negative is way more attractive to a vendor than a false positive, at least until their customers get owned as a result of it, right? So the customer wants to make sure that they don't get owned and they're meeting their own regulatory and contractual compliance obligations around known vulnerabilities. And as I said before, sometimes there's multiple hops in this chain. False positives are annoying. False negatives are a concern as well. The customer wants to know their true exposure and they want to know what to do about it and how urgently. Open source CNAs are somewhat similar. In many, if not most cases, they walk and talk like a vendor. In fact, a lot of the CNAs that are open source are often, but not always, also vendors. I think there's some inconsistencies in the CNA metadata for situations where they're not. So you've got potentially the same expected high fidelity because the CNA issuing the CVE has the greatest chance of having context on the details for the fix for it. Whoops. They have the potential to get interesting with things like Linux distributions. There's a bit of talk about that, particularly in the context of Red Hat earlier in the week, where they're redistributing vulnerable open source software. So, for example, a Linux distribution with its own package of curl. Things that had the potential to get interesting with Linux distributions. My understanding of the CNA rules are that it is rather complicated and nuanced as to when, where, and which CNA should or should not be issuing CVEs under those circumstances. And I can also appreciate that the way that things are currently operating, it's also challenging for an impacted vendor to be able to make an appropriate statement about one of these open source related CVEs when it's under the ownership of a different CNA. It would be an interesting case study and maybe a future VulnCon or Open Source Summit presentation to look at the reality versus the interpretation of these rules, in particular for a set of CVEs relating to open source software. Now we get to the more complex cases, starting with the bug bounty providers. Bug bounty providers are operating at arm's length from everyone else involved in the CVE transaction. They're paying the finder and issuing a CVE, typically based on what the finder has provided about the vulnerability, perhaps enhanced by their own understanding of the vulnerability as part of paying for it. This lack of context on fix information and needing to potentially act as an intermediary between the finder and the fixer means that these CVEs are much less likely to be initially published with fix information and are reliant on the vulnerability subject owner, Veronica, liaising with the bug bounty provider to ensure fixed information winds up on the CVE record. This added friction creates a barrier to higher quality CVE records, particularly in a timely manner. There's a lot more friction from the coordination overheads here and less alignment around the incentives of the finder and the end consumer. Finder doesn't care. Finder just wants the glory. The other complex case is the researcher CNA. There's a lot more of these types of CNAs, but they also overlap with either bug bounty providers or product vendors. So there's some really blurry lines around what CVEs get issued under the auspices of research and what the subject of the research is. The same problem around high quality fixed information applies as with bug bounty providers, and the same added coordination overheads. And we've got, I love reading the CNA scopes. We get into this whole CNA scope thing. As far as I can tell, there is no programmatic way to validate whether a CVE is legitimately within a CNA scope or not. And the enforcement of a CNA scope, I believe, is largely based on the honor system. If vendor CNA growth continues as it has been, I can see a downward trend in CVEs reported by bug bounty and researcher CNAs over time. I didn't run the numbers on that to sort of see if there's like inversely proportional number of CVEs being originated by them as vendors pop up to sort of be the first point of call for them. So here's my thoughts on some concrete steps forward. Firstly, make it abundantly clear what the program's mission statement means in 2025 and into the next 25 years. 25 years is a lovely, nice, round quarter of a century. What got you here won't get you there. Let's sort of, don't change the mission statement, just clarify how to interpret that 25 years later. Set a target for the desired standard of capability from a CVE record. Then incrementally start bringing program participants up to this standard. Make the JSON schema enforce this standard. Given the CVE program's primary metric of interest has historically been CNA growth, I'm not suggesting that it stop. Simply to have a flag day where new CNAs are held to a higher standard from the outset. Then there comes the effort of bringing all the existing CNAs up to this new, more stringent standard. I think the top 15 CNAs is a manageable number of cats to herd in the first instance, rather than 400 plus. These CNAs, as the underpinning of the CVE list by volume, can individually affect the greatest quality bang for buck in any given year and serve as models of the desired behavior. It's especially important that the CNA-LRs be models of that behavior that we want voluntary CNAs to adhere to. So I'm proposing that the CVE program take a use case-based approach, first conceived on the back of a napkin at VolCon last year, and to progressively ensure that all CVEs can meet these three basic use cases. Firstly, detection, automatable detection, accurate affected product information, CPEs, pearls, all the things, and then enable remediation prioritization. And then secondary prioritization and retrospective analysis, so your CWEs. This is going to take some strong leadership. There's going to be some pushback. There's going to be some feelings. It's going to require some selling. CISA is paying for this thing. They ultimately have a lot of power to attach some conditions on that funding. The CVE board, buck stops with you. As the program's governing body, and CNAs and CNA-LRs need to sign up to doing a better job. When you're dealing with a vulnerability researcher or some third party that's requesting a CVE from you, you have their attention. They want what you're given. Make sure you're getting what you want from them before you give it to them. Make them jump through the flaming hoops. Because once you've given them that thing, they're going to go away. And then the downstream consumers have a lot of opportunities here to be a little bit more sophisticated about what they're both, as I said, add this into your vendor selection process. Demand more of your vendors. Have some awkward conversations when there's contract renewals. Compare and contrast vendors. Like, it'd be cool to have some visualizations around, let's get competitive. Let's not make it a race to the bottom. Let's make it a race to the best, right? I'd like to see some challenges done about which vendors are kicking butt and taking names in the same markets, so that yeah, it becomes a bit of friendly competitive rivalry in that regard. And for vulnerability researchers, I know you don't necessarily care about the poor end users that are impacted, but ideally, if you're doing this in an ethical hacking, CVE, responsible vulnerability, responsible disclosure kind of way, maybe you do, right? So make sure that the CNA that's issuing that CVE for you is doing a full end-to-end sort of story for it, and that the fix information is in there, so that the people that are impacted by the thing that you're getting all the fame for is trivially fixable. Help them do better as well. How quickly can we do this? Can we make some tangible, durable improvements? CVE Program's 25. It's a big milestone. Only 9 years ago was that first major turning point with federation. The initial machine readable record improvements are only 7 years old. Can we turn things around by the end of the decade? I dare you. I challenge you. I'd like to think that with a will, there's a way. It's just going to require the key players to all pull in the same direction with a sense of urgency. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Andrew, thank you so much. An interesting challenge here at the VolnCon office, at the VolnCon conference. I have a couple questions in Discord. I'll do one first, and then I'll alternate here in the room and go back to Discord after each person. And I strongly recommend, Andrew, you take a look at the Discord. There's been some great comments and conversation going on.
Awesome. I will.
Our first question from the interwebs. OSV has just over 82,000 vulns, 56K to 9,000 or so. The slide went away. Is that to say that you have 12 to 15,000 distinct vulnerabilities without a CVE ID?
Where is it?
It was early on.
I got it. Here, right? Whoop. That one. So the question is, of that delta between 82,000, 83,000 and 58,500, are they potentially not, are they bespoke vulnerabilities yet to have been CVE issued? I haven't looked at them. I can't say. I don't know.
Could be
worth a look.
Could be an interesting talk next year.
Could be an interesting talk. Could be an interesting vulnerability research fertile exploration zone. So,
and I expect you and Jericho will be talking more about this. So I saw a question with Bruce and then Martin, and I'll bounce back in between the two to another Discord question.
My question was actually on this exact same slide.
How
What's
convenient.
the difference between the OSV numbers and the CVE numbers? And please enlighten me on that.
What's the difference?
Why are the numbers different?
Yeah. I guess I should have dug into that more and preempted that question, right? We have there's a little bit of overlap. So the GitHub advisory database is our largest. I should pull up the actual OSV.dev website where there's aggregate numbers. Which one? It sounds like you might have it up. Art, do you? No. You got thoughts? You got an answer here?
Sorry, I don't have an answer, but I looked at this. I was wondering, hey, in all of this awesome OSV data, could I find vulnerabilities lacking CVE IDs and then go make a case to go get them assigned with a machine, maybe?
Potentially.
I didn't find any easily.
Okay.
I think the easiest thing I can say is it's not at all one-to-one mapping.
Sure.
If you're thinking in CVE individual JSON files, individual records, it's not quite the same.
Yeah.
You got to spend some time looking at it. I haven't got there yet, but I'm going to be looking.
Yeah. I guess what I'll say is that the original focus of this exercise was source code level vulnerabilities. A bunch of those numbers will probably be OSS fuzz findings, which lack correspondence with the CVE, but there is potentially a CVE, or there might be an opportunity for there to be a CVE for those. The other one is that we might have a GitHub security advisory record, a CVE, a Debian advisory, a Red Hat advisory, a Golang advisory, a Python advisory, all for what is essentially the same CVE, but those ones will tie back to a CVE ID, so that wouldn't fall into that. I'm really bad at maths. What's the difference there? That delta that we're sort of pondering. But yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for the question.
Question from the internet.
Ooh.
This might be a little cheeky, but is there a PR to stop allowing NA to be listed as the vendor or the product? Any additional context random stranger might want to add to the internet?
Oh, no, I fixed that NA problem for you, Andrew, during the talk. I updated the schema to not allow it. So if somebody will just smash that merge button, there'll be no more CVEs within NA allowed.
Yeah, and like I'm a man of action. Send more PRs. Just do it. You know, like have the conversation over a PR. Like shed the actual implementation in a PR. Like I'm. The QWG meetings are at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. depending on daylight saving time for me. I don't want to get up that early and spend multiple weeks of talking about stuff. Let's act with a sense of urgency. Let's spitball the PRs rather than just keep talking.
Thanks for a great talk, Andrew. Funnily enough, I think NA is the default value for the MITRE CNA. So I wonder if that's going to be merged. Anyway, my question was, are you suggesting that we drop bug bounty programs for being CNAs?
Hot take.
I'm not necessarily. I think that it's important to acknowledge that it is more difficult. I think the way that they will get dropped organically is if the subject of the bug bounty becomes a vendor, right? Because there's that implicit scope clash at that point where it is no longer the bug bounty's purview to issue a CVE for that. You know, Veronica issues that for her product because Veronica is a CNA. Now, obviously, there's more software in the world and there's going to be potentially vendor CNAs for it, right? And that's why the CNA last resort exists. So no, I don't think bug bounty providers will or should go away. I do think it's incumbent on them to acknowledge their role in the full end-to-end ecosystem of making sure that the downstream customers that are impacted of the vulnerability that they're publicizing can deal with it appropriately, right? Hello.
Hello. Hi.
My good friend.
I forget the slide.
Which
I
one
forget
would you
the slide that you had on the automated updates or updates to the schema for automation.
Updates to the schema. Was it before or after this one? Do you know?
I think it was after.
Okay. Oh, was it this one? No. That was that. Or was it something else? Anyway.
Yeah. Anyways, it
What
was basically alluding to that there might be missing properties or properties we need to better validate. So what would be your first pick of something to focus on for what would help with automation?
Jerry, do you want the floor? Jerry talked about this earlier in the week. You know, like I would say go take a look at the OSV schemas, JSON schema syntax spec. And please, PR is welcome if there's something in there where I've missed something. But I went down the belly of the beast of JSON schema syntax. They're cool. Like the JSON schema project's awesome. They have office hours. Like I had a lovely chat with somebody in the UK in their morning, in my afternoon one day, and said, "Matt, can you help me?" And so look to the OSV schema for inspiration, but you know, there is plenty of opportunity for adding some validation. Like Jerry, it's 1 to 400,096 characters for a description, for example, right? Like that's an easy one, right? Like find the shortest existing description in existence and make that allowable at a minimum to start the conversation, and then figure out what is the most sensibly short description. Like obviously we don't want people putting lorem ipsum in there just to validate successfully, but you can't do that in the JSON schema, right? Like this is what I'm saying. Like there are limits to what you can validate with the JSON schema. You can validate the presence of and a regex. Maybe you can have a regex with Simba. I don't know, but you then couldn't validate that the affected version, the introduced version is earlier than the fixed version. You can still have stupid things like that. So at that point, you need something more clever, like a linter that looks at it and says, no, that's not right. Hello. We've had some good
No,
chats.
I have a silly pedantic question.
Never.
Nothing interesting.
Oh, no.
One of your slides said you had 22 feeds, and
Mhm.
another one said 21. And then I
As
was
of 2024, we've got an extra one that
like,
came on.
what are those? But then I could validate it myself. But then, so I went to OSV.dev and I only counted 18 feeds. Do you have like an extra slide where it like,
Okay, there's a
details?
difference between a home database and an ecosystem,
okay.
right? You would have
you're
gone to
counting 22
OSV.dev and seen
ecosystems.
ecosystems.
Mhm.
So the GitHub advisory database contributes, help keep me honest, friends at GitHub, quite a few, like maybe I'll say upwards of half a dozen different ecosystems. So for example, we get Go
Ruby.
Go vulnerabilities with a GHSA and with a Go prefix. So there's a one-to-one mapping between record identifier prefixes and ecosystems. So that's, so you counted ecosystems. I talked about home databases. Subtle difference.
Mm.
Appreciate the scrutiny.
You mentioned bug bounty earlier.
Yeah.
And I'm personally not a fan of bug bounties handing out CVEs. I think they should come from the vendors.
Mhm.
But on top of that, bug bounty is a very powerful tool.
Yes.
I love integrity, by the way.
Yeah. They have never issued a CVE. I don't believe. I went and looked. They are a CNA, but they've not issued one.
Yeah, they're a powerful tool in the fact that you can encourage researchers to follow the best practices.
Yep.
And make sure you get the data out of them.
Yes, that's my point.
And then you can also use the bounty.
Mhm.
All right, you didn't give me this, I'm cutting this much off. You didn't give me this, I'm
Yeah.
cutting this much
Yeah.
off. And money talks.
I've quit my day job to go back to school to study psychological science and counseling, and I'm learning all about motivation this trimester. There's a human factors component here, right? And so I'm looking at ways that we can motivate carrot and stick, dollars and praise, changes in behavior, right? Everything cybersecurity related is ultimately changes in behavior, right? So yeah, like I think bug bounty providers should exist. They are a force for good in terms of keeping 0 days off the black market, right? And focusing research in particular, either areas, like they're an incentive. So yeah, I don't think they should go away. And I don't even think they should necessarily not issue CVEs. I think, as I said to the question before, like I think there's going to be an organic sort of scope carve out situation. Yeah, Integrity's never issued a CVE, right?
Yeah, so just really, thoughtful dialogue, great presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
But in kind of just a tongue-in-cheek question, I guess, if I started a software company named NA, would I be forever immune to CVA assignments? No.
Wouldn't that be terrible? It's like the guy that got the registration plate for something like some placeholder value and got all the speeding tickets in the world from some DMV somewhere, right? Like, yeah, that'd be amusing.
So if I could get a round of applause for Andrew, thank you for a great presentation.